Well, hey, I apologize if my voice is a little rough this morning. My alter ego is rock and roll god, you know, screaming guitars, amplifiers, and microphones. So after about 2.5 hours of talking, singing and yelling and all that kind of stuff last night, I'm a little rough. So I will do the very best I can today. The basics of my presentation today come from one place. And when Rich asked me to do this, I just knew this is the one that I've been waiting to do for a long time. Took me just a moment to synthesize it, but I did a CSCS and Certified Personal Trainer test prep session 2 weeks ago at the NSCA Midwest Regional Clinic that I put on, and we drew about 200 people to that clinic, so it was pretty large. And we did that this time up in Missouri, and I'm just going to tell you right now, we're going to bring that sucker back here to South Texas in a few years. And so as soon as we can get everybody on board, we're going to have probably about half of you guys that are sitting out here talking at it. You know what I'm talking about, Adam Farrell? Okay, so we're going to get you guys up here. And when I was doing the CSCS prep test session, I basically went from 8 in the morning till 5 on all the science type stuff. And I take a lot of questions during those sessions. Some people don't, but I do. And basically, I just went back and wrote down all of the questions that I've been getting, which in today's words really amount to a lot of bro science. You guys know what bro science is, right? So I know for sure that I'm not going to teach some of you a whole lot, but if not, I can give you something to think about. And so really, the foundation of what gets most of us into our field, for the most part, comes specifically from being corrected and being just humble enough to say, you know, that's what I've always thought, but now I've been taught differently. Wow, I'm more educated now, rather than, how dare you? How dare you contradict what I've been telling my athletes 10 minutes ago? I very recently went out into a high school where I addressed a coach and his group of athletes on some specific things. They were long distance runners, and you're going to see this here in just a few moments, okay? And the one thing that they came back at me with, because I made some comment about something that is pertinent to those long distance runners, and I didn't know quite what was going on at the time, but all of the athletes sitting there that I was talking to turned around and went like this and looked at the coach, and I'm like, what? But apparently I found out that the coach has been teaching them the exact opposite of what I had just told them, and I know for sure that after I got read out for contradicting that coach to his athletes, basically, he should have said, wow, I didn't realize that. Now I know better. Instead, he got really mad. I'm not going back to that high school anytime soon. So that's kind of what it's all about. But honestly, there's a lot of these types of things. So I'm really just going to show you how a lot of this stuff gets out there. We think certain things for a certain reason. We're going to take a quick look at those, and then we're going to talk about the realities. And so I'm really going to illustrate how some of the things that we continually do aren't really that great of an idea. And so hopefully, if you're offended, you're also humble enough to maybe change your tune just a little bit and kind of go on from there. So I'm not going to resolve each one of these, but I hope what it is for you is a place to step on, start some inquiry, and get yourself straightened out. Because if you do go on for any level of certification, especially as a strength and conditioning specialist, you're going to run into these things. Most of the questions that I got are addressed in those types of certification tests. And so that's usually what it comes down to. So today's format, belief, myth, or bad practice. And the rest of, I'm going to throw a few in that I get from my students, especially the young ones that leave my program, and then they go out there into the schools, they start their coaching job, and the next thing you know, Doc, this is what I'm dealing with. What should I do? And you'll see those at the very end of what I'm doing today. So we're going to talk about the myth and bad practice. Why do we think this? And then we're going to get a bit of a reality check. And that's where the exercise physiology comes in. The truth of the matter is, most of the stuff, you're not going to find an answer from an exact study that's out there. So I'm going to give you some references that you can use, and when Rich gets these out to you guys, if you want to see, I put basically my references for these things. Most of the time, you have to piece this information together, because it doesn't have an exact answer from an exact study. It's usually a culmination of things, and most of it can be found in a textbook. Imagine that. But you probably sold all those back. All right, that's usually how that works. So number one, I couldn't resist the long distance running. Now, Long distance runners should only use high repetitions in the weight room. And as you'll see when you get a hold of these a little bit later on, I did put my resources where you can find many of these types of answers. And so I'm going to kind of go hot, heavy, and fast in these kind of things, so just kind of hang on. All right, so why do we think that runners necessarily need high repetitions? Because they need muscular endurance, and that's actually very true. And we know just by default that muscular endurance usually involves some level of higher repetitions. And it really seems specific to what they already do. And maybe a reason is that you forgot the basic 3 elements of the energy systems. We're going to talk about those in just a moment. And maybe you can't think of anything better for them to do. There's a lot of coach influence in terms of long distance running. There just is. And it's passed on from coach to coach to coach. My coach did this to me and I was successful, therefore I must repeat the same. And those are actually good life lessons, but there is better. And that's what we're trying to get into. So the reality check is this. We could perform 20 sets of about 100 reps and still never mimic exactly what they do during a 10-mile run. We just can't do that. Number 2 thing, we stimulate anaerobic pathways through resistance training, not aerobic pathways through resistance training. I don't care how long you do that set, you're not going to get into an aerobic state. It doesn't work like that. All right, you may cross over into a second energy system, but you're never going to reach the aerobic system. And if your actual set is carrying on for 3 or 4 minutes, you have a serious problem. Okay, so think about it. What can we do with these people? We can strength train so that they have reinforced integrity in many of their structures. Proper muscle groups strengthen. Maybe more injury resistant. That's probably one of the hallmarks of strength and conditioning right now, is how much you can keep them out of the athletic training room. That's what it's all about. You start injuring players and stuff in your facility, you're gone. That's the way that works nowadays. And finally, I would really recommend for you that you go back and look at the basic aerobic adaptations versus the basic anaerobic adaptations. Those answers are found in these types of areas. Now we're going to talk a little bit more. There's a few of these on long distance running, so I'm not going to blow all my material in one way. But long distance runners should not use heavy weights when lifting. Primarily, why do we think this? Heavy lifting may not be specific to what those people do, and they really aren't built for heavy lifting. Well, that may be true, but the truth is that a lot of times heavy is relative to what they can lift. It's not going to be the same between a long distance runner, and it's not going to be the same to a linebacker. 2 different things, and you may not even use the same lifts. The other thing, you don't want them to be too bulky and slow them down. This is one of the several things that those players turned around and looked back at the coach about. Okay? So the reality check is this. Heavy's relative. Runners do utilize anaerobic systems while running. And I'm going to show you how that works in just a few moments. We're going to get there. But the truth is that while aerobic might be the primary energy system that they're using when they're doing steady state type of work, anytime that they elevate, that system is going to turn on. And as a matter of fact, that system is on anyway during that time. Where do they use it during performance primarily? Up here at the high end. So if I can maintain my high end, let's say I go to 100%, and I can maintain it for 10 seconds, 12 seconds, 13 seconds. Through what is heavy training for me, I'm going to take what I used to have in terms of my high intensity capabilities, and I'm going to go like this. High level running is a game of seconds, and even split seconds. So if I can get more out of my high end by resistance training anaerobically as an aerobic athlete, fine. So the resistance training can't get to their aerobic system, but it can take care of the part that it can take care of. And so high repetitions and things like that don't usually solve the problem. The research is actually very clear on this. Very clear. It's ridiculous, as a matter of fact. Have you ever seen anybody get too big? I've been trying to get too big for 30 years, and I'm not a runner. So if I'm running 30 plus miles per week, is that really going to happen? And have you ever seen the build of a long distance runner? They don't bulk up too easily. They're lighter, a lot of slow twitch, which are generally smaller, generally, not always. That's kind of what we're dealing with. So we have that kind of stuff too. Strength trained muscle only loses performance when I stop practicing. All right, so if I take the off season as a long distance runner and become a lifter only, guess what? I probably am going to compromise my running capabilities. And then we're going to perpetuate the myth over and over and over again. And so if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And of course, you got to remember that the sets, reps, lifts, the whole scheme may not be the same if you're using a one-size-fits-all strength and conditioning scheme. And I see that one over and over and over again in my world. And so you find something that works for one group, it might work for all groups. And it actually might, but there's good, there's better, and then there's best. And there may only be best for your personal situation. It's kind of how it works. Oh boy, here's the one that got me in trouble also. Runners should keep the protein levels down. Research is ridiculously clear. Why do we think this? Coach taught me that this is how they were successful, therefore it must be true. The carb monster thing, there's no doubt about it, all right? Those carbohydrates are going to be important for the energy source for these guys. It's that simple. There are some newer methods. I'm just telling you what's coming. We've got some aerobic athletes that are going low carb these days, and they're adapting over into the fat use, okay? Fat traditionally is made for longer, slower stuff. Carbohydrate provides higher, faster stuff. But they're looking very closely to find out, well, that works that way in the person who eats mostly carbs, protein, and fats anyway. But right now, they're looking at, well, what if I got rid of the carbs? What will my body do? Will it actually adapt over to using that fat for high intensity work? And the preliminary stuff says, yes, it does. Yes, it does. So I don't think that's going to change what a lot of people do, but it is an interesting take on the evolution of exercise physiology at this point. Runners don't need as much protein as other athletes. We don't want them to become too big and too bulky. Oh, that hurts my head. So they can run faster and longer. And actually, maybe I haven't kept up with any research in the last 20 plus years on the topic. All right, so that's kind of how that goes. So the reality check is this. We already talked about the growing too big stuff. We can be successful and fundamentally wrong at the same time. So what they've been doing, if that's what they've been doing, you can be very successful using any of those types of things. Even if the myths are applied and they're wrong, you can still be good at what you do. However, when you kind of step back and take a look at it from a slightly different perspective, I know weightlifters think they've got the market cornered on muscular damage, but they don't. They surely don't. They're very naive, very self-centered sometimes. I've been there. I'm as guilty of most of these things as probably some of you. Okay, you're going to find something in here you're guilty of. I'm probably guilty of all of them. And so don't put me in any ivory tower just because I'm up here talking today. So realistically, before and after a 10-mile run, you see the beautiful, remember back to your ex-phys and your basic A and P, you got your beautiful Z-line structure, Z-line to Z-line, sarcomeres, actin, myosins. This is the before. You don't see much of that now. It's basically been destroyed because exercise is controlled damage. So is training. All right, and so a little further here, the reality check continued. Runners use all of their fuels at some point, whether it's fats, proteins, or carbohydrates. And actually, the protein requirements for runners are pretty much the same as they are for lifters. And we're looking at two ends of the spectrum. Most athletes are somewhere in the middle, unless they lean a little bit more, maybe more aerobic, maybe more anaerobic, that kind of stuff. But, you know, here's your sedentary adult. Here's your basic strength athlete, and I've seen them go as high as 1.8, that kind of stuff. The runners, check it out. Same baseline, not much difference there. Not much difference at all. And that, I'll tell you what, that has been research that's been available for over 20 years at this point. That's kind of how this whole thing is rolling. So it's kind of amazing that we still think that. And primary reason, as opposed to lifters, a lot of my students think that the lifters use the protein for a fuel to rebuild. Let's break that down. They use it to rebuild, but they don't use it as a fuel to power their activity. So when I'm in there in the weight room, I'm not necessarily using energy that comes directly from protein, mostly from my most anaerobic stores, ATP phosphocreatine system. All right, and in this case, runners are not only using it to rebuild and repair, but they are also sparing their carbohydrates, and they use some protein in order to offset that, maybe up to 15 to 25%. I've seen the numbers go that high. And so it depends on the situation, the person, the metabolism, things like that. That's how that works. So the runners are going to use all those fuels. To lift weights, I may not use all of those fuels at the same time. So the differences aren't a whole heck of a lot different. Now, if I'm trying to become a high-level bodybuilder, which it seems like a lot of athletes try to do at the off-season, you may have a different thing. According to the research right now, there is no great proof that going beyond 2 grams per kilo of body weight actually does very much more. And so anything up to that general neighborhood, and those recommendations were already out there. So this is the area I'd like to call anti-exercise physiology. Here we go again. It makes me hurt right there. I got a lot of those, and this was really pervasive last week. Some of you coaches and whatnot, I'm really sorry about this. Lactic acid causes muscle soreness. So, you know, you're all familiar with your basic energy systems, I hope, and if not, they're a great thing to go back and look at, even though they looked horrible in that exercise physiology book. The A&P books, they just tell you what they are. The exercise physiology takes A&P and says, yeah, what if we do this to it? That's the difference. So you've got your basic 3, your 8 to 10 seconds. You see some variation on that number. You've got your lactic acid system and, of course, your aerobic system. And the only one of those 2, or 3 actually, that produces lactic acid is that center system. This is the only place it's going to be produced. All right, but there are some new realizations about lactic acid. We're going to get to those. Most people think of the energy systems like this, like if I start running or if I start doing something like walking, I'm going to use this energy system. If I go to running, it's going to switch off and I'm going to go use the other energy system. Forget that. It's not like a light switch. Never has been. Here, I told you some things I'm going to help you think about slightly differently. As a matter of fact, it's more like this. Everything's always on, even right now. So the realization is if I were to walk over there to my lab, come back here with the lactic acid meter and pop this guy right in the finger and steal some of his blood and put it on the strip, South Texans know about glucose testing, trust me. All right? It's the same concept. If I take that lactic acid meter and I put a little drop of blood on there and shove it back in the machine, he's producing lactic acid right now as he's sitting in here. The problem is, well, it's not really a problem, it's a dang good thing. He's not accumulating it. He's getting rid of it faster than he's producing it, so there is no problem. All right? So basically, when we go back to basic exercise physiology, glucose goes in, and this is horrible, goes through glycolysis, and this is your carbohydrate product, and basically comes out as lactate at the bottom end. It is still a carbohydrate. If you cut off my arm and my leg, I'm still a human being, but I'm a little different. Take off all of my limbs, I'm still a human being, I'm a lot more different. Same thing with carbohydrate. We basically chopped off pieces and parts, and what we have left is a shell of carbohydrate. That shell is reusable, recyclable, and a perfect setup for future use. All right, so always some degree of on with the energy systems. And really, I'm going to get to the lactic acid stuff a little bit more, but here's the deal. Here's your basic energy systems. AT phosphocreatine right here. You've got your middle distance right here, and you ramp up towards your aerobic distance as your time increases right there. But there's always some level of crossover in the energy systems, always. Matter of fact, I could put one big circle right through here where they could all potentially be on at the same time. It's just that that dimmer switch, if I'm doing long distance running, that dimmer switch on the aerobic system is up much higher. The others are much lower. They're still there. The problem with lactic acid comes when I can't get rid of it fast enough, and then there's some issues. So what happens to that lactic acid? Very simple. Glucose goes through glycolysis, ends up as lactate, shoves it out into the blood system, into the arterial system. They take it down to the liver, and that lactate is converted back over to glucose. Gluconeogenesis. Gluco as in glucose, neo as in new, genesis as in, you may have read that book somewhere, I don't know. But at that point, where we turn it back into glucose, if we stop doing our work, we can store it for later in case we need it. Or we can give it back directly to glucose, shove it into the blood again, and take it back to that working muscle where it can either be stored or used right there on the spot. It does not hang around in your muscle tissue for several days after you lift, making you want to cuss. It just doesn't, okay? Kind of the way it goes. So why do we blame it on lactate? Here's the reason, and in one way we've already known this. Whenever the pain shows up during activity, that's when lactate also appears. But it's like you standing outside a house next door and watching the neighbor's house burn. It doesn't mean you did it. It just means you're there watching and hoping your house doesn't burn down as well. So it's kind of I was in the wrong place at the wrong time and got blamed for what it is that's happening there. It's kind of how that works. So there's a faulty association as well. Pain in the muscle during exercise, knowing that it could have somewhat of a basis with lactic acid, but not much actually. That may have something to do with the pain the next day, and why not blame something on something that has the word acid in it? It's kind of like a dirty word almost physiologically. So that's kind of, we could think of it that way if you want to. So what causes the muscle soreness? Simple enough. Exercise is controlled damage. We are systematically damaging ourselves during training, period. We just are, straight up. So whenever you twist your ankle, whenever you trade punches in the arm with your buddy when you're drunk, okay, or something else, and that arm hurts the next day because you did stupid things or got injured, you don't blame it on lactic acid. You blame it on the fact that some idiot hit you in the arm. It's not the same thing. If it really were, you'd blame that on lactic acid too. But we don't, because we know better. So we have a degeneration of that tissue, an inflammation response, just like anything else you've ever seen, and we have a breakdown of the basic muscle. When I ask a lot of people, so what actually causes a muscle to grow stronger and larger? We'll say, well, it gets broken down. That's how it gets stronger and larger. No, that's how it gets broken down. How it actually gets stronger and bigger is that we go through a regenerative process. I don't think most people realize this, but this just blows me away. That's why I'm an exercise physiologist. I still amaze myself to this day, not because I'm great, but because of the stuff that I just realize about what I do. And that is, every single time that I exercise, and if I break down one muscle fiber, I have to send signals to my DNA level and RNA to tell them to start producing new proteins. I'm basically impacting myself on the most microcellular levels that you can possibly imagine, just simply because I exercised. I don't know, there's something about that I find just ridiculously cool. And so finally, the soreness does not indicate, now here's just a myth within itself, doesn't indicate that your training was good, effective, or progressive. It just doesn't. It simply tells you that you did something. And fatigue actually may be a better indicator because soreness doesn't last forever. I love the guys in the gym, I can't get sore anymore. Well, congratulations, you made it to a high training level. Well, I like soreness. Well, I kind of like it too, I admit. Anybody else sick like that? All right. I like it. But it doesn't last, so maybe you have to start relying on fatigue. And if you need to know that a certain muscle group was impacted by what you did, so be it. That's the way you do it. And so it really indicates that you did some serious damage and you need some time to recover. And if it basically comes down to delayed onset muscle soreness, you started, well, some classic symptoms of DOMS actually are mitochondrial swelling, okay? You not only broke down the muscle fiber, you went inside and beat them up before you burned down the house. It's kind of a horrible analogy, I know, but basically you beat up all the little pieces, the lysosomes, the peroxisomes, all the different organelles. They basically got busted up in the process, and then you tore the house down through the exercise. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you did better because you were sore 2 days later versus the next day. I've got some pretty sweet next day soreness right now. Kind of cool. Soreness is normal and should lessen with time, especially when that person becomes more accustomed to the things that we do. This is its own presentation. I'll just throw that out there right now. Okay. I go through a lot of students, and the largest majority of them will say, yeah, I screwed up one day and my coach made me go till I puke. Oh, okay. My coach did this to me and his and hers before that, so it must be okay. I need to teach somebody a lesson. I need to generate discipline. I really think it's because somebody just doesn't have a heck of a lot of imagination out there. And honestly, their coaching skills are horrible. If that's the only level of punishment you know how to exact, you need to get a new hobby. Simple enough. I don't mind saying it as it is, but that's one of the worst techniques you could possibly use. And so, honestly, the reality check, this is a really stupid thing to do, okay? I don't know where else to go with that. Absolutely amazing. Okay, so you may or may not be able to achieve this in some people. It doesn't always work. It has happened to me, but it's something that I did. What types of places? Mostly hotter weather, lesser trained people. I can recall on numerous occasions doing multiple sets of squats in a relatively hot environment, and it's a good thing I had the trash can next door. All right, so that kind of stuff can definitely happen. And the thing of it is, here's what happens. It's often triggered basically because those large muscles you're working on, and that's another criteria for this, the large muscles get used, they produce that lactate, dumps out into your blood, lowers your pH by just the smallest point nothing amount, and you're like, oh, that's how it goes. So the next thing you know, you're sitting down or throwing up, one of the two, and it goes away relatively fast. That's why people say, I got right back in and did some more after that, and that's their badge of, that's their bragging rights, basically. Okay, a lot of that stuff out there. So it's that same system that's being enacted as you see it. It shows it right back out into the blood system. So really has no redeeming benefits whatsoever. Again, if this is used as a method of, training, good luck. Yeah. Okay. I had this one the other day. I ran into a coach last weekend who does not like to use high repetitions because he doesn't want to, what was he said, wasting fat stores or something like that. I'm thinking, holy cow. This goes right back to what we just said about the long distance runners, to be honest with you. We think this because it's possibly feasible, and sometimes we're desperate as we're trying to retain the 6 or 8 pack that we had, maybe a few years ago, or maybe we've had too much beer or something like that. And so honestly, really is feasible if you're not thinking. It sounds good, and it's oftentimes very desperate. We gravitate towards what seems feasible. Classic exercise physiology study. They had a large group do, 1,000 reps per week across multiple movements for abdominal work. All right, they did this for 6 or 8 weeks, and they measured the fat thickness on 11 different places across the abdomen and found no changes whatsoever. All right, I don't care how many reps you're doing. Theoretically, although I wouldn't do it this way, but theoretically I can get as much fat loss from around the muscle doing 1 rep as I can doing 30. Theoretically. I probably use a different amount of calories, but that's a different story. Fats is kind of its own thing, honestly. We believe directly targeting that area over the top somehow magically burns the fat over the top of the muscle, and for some reason we think that those reps are going to activate that fat oxidation pathway. It doesn't happen that way, okay? It doesn't. All right, so that's the reality check. Resistance training is not going to use fat as a source of fuel, or even if you do a lot of reps on there. Basically, and this is, I hate to throw this at you, all right, but typically this is what happens. We do build more muscular endurance when we do higher repetitions. However, just recently saw 2 2014 and 1 2015 studies that actually showed in clinical backup that didn't happen. They actually found more with lower reps that were heavier. All right, so I don't know where this is going. You're not going to find it in a textbook just yet, but this is, man, that kind of changes our whole dogma about what we think about muscular endurance. The disclaimer is on this, and this is why they put this in there for fat loss types of things, honestly. We actually, as we grow a more metabolically active muscle or even a larger muscle, we build a bigger furnace to burn more fat in. So basically, we are offsetting our body composition if we gain muscle. So therefore, if I gain 1 pound of muscle and I don't change any of my body fat, I've in effect lowered my body fat percentage, simply because I have more lean mass. And that's part of the whole thing. So I can lose fat mass to lose body composition, I can gain muscle to lose body composition, and I can do both at the same time, which is much harder to do than most people actually would think. Here's the other one. Ran into a coach the other day that told me that he went out and bought, what was it, like 15 solar suits for his athletes because they keep coming into season overweight. I almost got mad, but I'm an educator, so I keep it cool. I'm a little bit more boisterous than normal right now, okay? Only because of where I'm at, but Your guess is as good as mine as why we think this. This is probably an association thing, would be my best guess. We often lose weight before and after sweating in great amounts. Anybody ever sweat a lot and weighed themselves before and after? And you wore really heavy sweats and maybe you had the garbage bags? South Texas, God love those people that are out there trying to make it happen. They're losing some weight, they're working hard, running along the side of the street, and they crinkle as they walk by rather than you hear the plastic underneath. All right, they literally have garbage bags and solar suits on under heavy sweats. Yes, you are going to lose weight. That's water. All right? I've actually had to pick up several people off the side of the road who have almost passed out because of that one thing. And so we associate hard work and sweating with fat loss, and that's kind of the problem. We slept during exercise physiology too, maybe, I don't know. But realistically, fat and sweat are not the same thing. Fat does not seep out your pores. Anybody greasy after they work out rather than just wet? I didn't think so. Fat is oil. Your human fat is just like any other fat that you might use, or anything that solidifies in your pan because you don't want to do your dishes till the next morning or much later. Okay? That's fat. And fat, well, it's greasy, right? If it were really fat, you'd wipe off with that towel and you'd be like, oh, still nasty. And our soaps would be an entirely different game after that point. And so that's kind of the whole problem here. Sweat primarily is coming from your blood volume. You're actually concentrating your blood as you sweat. Your blood's becoming more thick, more viscous because a lot of your blood volume is coming out, and that's why we have to keep replacing it. It's a wonderful thing, actually. So how is it done, basically? It's done like this. The fat is liberated from the cell, lipolysis, basically. We break that triglyceride up into its component parts. We send the carbohydrate backbone to be processed as glucose. We take the fat and we send it down to the big furnace, that being your muscle, and there we oxidate it and liberate massive amounts of ATP for the activities that we're trying to do. We have to teach our bodies to do this well. It's not automatic for everybody, and everybody's different. So it's never a visible process. And, you know, I know all of you can answer this, but, you know, if you're inducing hyper sweat, the first time you actually put something back in your body, everything has a water content, it's going to go right back immediately. And I know people who get on the scale after they eat, who get on the scale after they work out, you name it. Pretty ridiculous concept overall. But the other thing is, you know, heat stroke, heat sickness, heat issues. This is South Texas. Amazing the number of people who get crazy with this one out there. This was a big one that I dealt with, and I'm actually a little bit more serious about this one because a lot of my coaches came to me 2 weeks ago and they said, you know, a lot of my people come in season and they are overweight, and they try to tackle this a little bit more because honestly in the collegiate ranks or even in high school, many of you get your athletes at about the time when they come back from the summer and it's time to compete again. But sometimes they don't come in very good shape. You've all seen it. And in my case, as a strength coach, and I know Coach Rich has probably had this as well, we get even collegiate athletes on a very regular basis who have never lifted weights or trained out of their pool, their track, or they've never resistance trained or off-task trained at all. There's been no floor training, there's been no any kind of training beyond that. So it's all a brand new game to them. So sometimes, you know, we go to default logic on this and said if they look fat or if they've lost mobility from season to season or they are heavier on the scale, it must be fat's fault, and it actually can be. All right, but the mistakes start to come when the coach takes this into their own hands. It's very simple. If that person isn't ready to play because they gained too much excess weight, they can't move, they can't perform, they likely do have to lose some weight, but dang, in season is not the time to do it, realistically. So we really think, you know, we go to the default mode most of the time on this kind of thing in order to lose the fat. We think we know what we know, and we know just enough to be dangerous, but we don't know enough most of the time to be either accurate or safe. That's where it gets ugly. And sometimes I've seen him do this to set an example. He's running during practice. And if you come in like that, you're going to be doing the same thing. Can't understand why we still do stuff like that, but the truth of the matter is that simultaneous weight loss and expected performance at a high level are contraindicated. They don't work. Several years ago, we had a guy here who was probably about 7 feet tall playing basketball. He hadn't played much basketball prior to that point, and he probably had 50 pounds to lose easily. He couldn't move very well. He was really ineffective, but they wanted that 7-footer. And the head coach of the basketball team at the time, not saying any names because there's been a lot of them at this point, but you could scale it down if you wanted to. He was really, really ticked off, not only at me, but at the player. He had this guy doing high-level exercise in addition to practice, in addition to eating a relatively low-calorie diet. Think about what a guy who's 7 feet tall, who weighs 300 pounds, think about the caloric consumption. In my best guesstimation, it was less than half of what it should have been. Number one, the guy wasn't losing weight very well at all. And I'm figuring his metabolism probably shut down for protection at about that point. And he was really mad at all of us, and I didn't have anything to do with this programming. I said, you need to send this guy to a nutritionist, somebody who knows sports nutrition, and you need to encourage him on how to how to do this during the off season, to be real honest with you. So there's really no mystery here at all to me when a person can't perform like that. Before you decide an athlete is too fat realistically, and I know I'm getting all PC on you, but honestly, you know, if you don't know what it is, you need to find a qualified somebody to do a body composition analysis on that person. I highly always advise dietary stuff, and this is the thing that you want to learn about you giving dietary advice. And also, dietary supplements, I wouldn't even go near those things if I were you. And I'm not anti-supplement. Most people peg academics almost immediately as anti-supplement because it doesn't fit an agenda. I'm not. I'm really anti-stupid with supplements. I'm not anti-supplement. That's just it. And so you need to know what you're doing. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. And so, you know, especially if you're dealing with high school kids and grade school kids, those kids don't have control over the food that comes into their house, and they likely aren't cooking for themselves either. That's usually how that whole situation works, unfortunately. So let's look at a few training issues along the way. I don't know, maybe this has something, I won't say the CF word out loud. I don't know. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is, okay? Oh, I could get ugly over this one. I don't, you know, especially if you're working at if anything prior to college rank, and even if you're working in the collegiate ranks, and I think we probably pegged most of you at this point, you don't understand that some of the things that you do may or may not have huge impacts in the future, especially in younger, lesser trained populations. This is how this whole thing works. Most young athletes aren't getting hurt in the weight room, therefore I keep doing what I'm doing. Okay, you're lucky in some respects because young athletes are so durable, very durable. They can take a lot. Trust me, after you cross that 25-year-old barrier, all right, recovery and all the evils of your past catch up to you. That's what happens. I fight very hard every day to keep myself in check that way. It's the way we do it. It's the lifestyle. So, I mean, honestly, I get this all the time. In a classroom, standard classroom, I'll ask about people's workout routines, and I deal with primarily 20 to 23-year-olds on average, unless they're graduate students. Typically, about 50% of the guys in the room will tell me that due to bench pressing in high school, they don't have any shoulders left. I'm talking to a 23-year-old who does not have joints left because of what they did, or maybe somebody who coached them. I'm not saying it's always a coach's fault. A lot of people lift without a coach. And that's kind of the way that works. Same thing with knees. You see, you think of the same exact thing. I can't think of anything more pathetic. To think that we may not have anything to do with that is relatively ridiculous. There are plenty of things that we can do, and you should research those topics just a little bit more. Many young athletes don't show the signs of chronic injury due to poor training until years later. Coach Rich and you guys back there on the staff, you get them all the time that you have to work around. The most difficult part of a strength and conditioning person's job is working around what people can't do anymore. And even if I'm a personal trainer or a fitness specialist, the same exact thing. They don't have a knee, that blows a little bit of my agenda. They're missing a shoulder, doesn't work very well. Unless I've got the talent to work through that and better them, which I know some of you do, I'm not that good in that area. Just tell you flat out, but some of you are. but there's a way. You got to learn about those things. So if you ever considered that athletic training shouldn't mean anything to you, the offender list on this is way too long. All right, so I limited them to the things that I experienced, and you guys could probably go on for days on this. Just be honest with you. So some of the things that I've typically experienced, wow, I've got 400 pounds on my back, and you don't know any better. You instruct that kid to go, have a seat, wait a moment, rock back, and then rock back forward again, and then stand back up. Meanwhile, my spine is being compressed on a solid surface with 400 pounds on my back. As a strength coach, I'm a touch and go kind of guy. I don't plant that rear end on that thing. I come down and touch, boom, back up again. Why would I want to, and I've heard all this crap about, well, you don't activate this particular blah, 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 blah. I don't really care. It ain't worth spinal compression. Now, a young person, they're going to hold on to that. They're probably going to be just fine while they're with you, but then they get to college and guess what? They have all kinds of issues. And I'll tell you what, I just don't want to get too started on that one. Here's another one I've seen. Improper warm-ups prior to high-intensity work. All right, we all need to work on that one, every single one of us. Improper starting, stopping, change of direction technique. There is a technique, and if you don't know that technique, you need to learn that technique because it is the producer of multiple injuries. And if you don't know how to do those stops and starts, and instead it's one of these, when you go for a quick change of direction, that's what you need to work on. Improper jumping and landing technique, improper progressions of any type. You should know multiple progressions for every single lift that you do, every single drill. You should know how to break down something complicated into something easy that's a starting point for everybody, especially if you've got even one person who isn't capable of the high-level movement. You've got somebody down here at the lower level. You need to give them stages that they can get through to become competent. And it's so much better to do something properly than it is to do it at high speed. All right, I don't care what it takes. If I'm doing a basic standard T-test agility or something like that, and I can't do it the right way, but I sacrifice the right way for speed so I can get a better number on the coach's stupid board, guess what? It ain't worth it. It ain't worth it. I'd rather compare myself against myself rather than compare it against somebody else who did it fast, is going to hurt themselves, and makes the rest of us trying to make the rest of us look bad after all. So I know you guys have seen a lot in this neighborhood. I'm not going to get into a lot of feedback on it, but think about it for a while in terms of things that you personally have seen and they're out there. You've got to analyze yourself. Wow, I think Coach Rich is going to talk a little bit about this one, but this was an intense conversation we had last week with some of the, 2 weeks ago with some of the coaches. Does strength training actually produce power? And yeah, it actually does, because we like a one-stop approach to most performance aspects, and there is some truth to that, and it's all locked up in the most basic of elements. Here's what you're going to find about people who are ridiculously good at what they do. They take the most basic notions of something and they do it so much better than the rest of us. Those basic things you learned in biomechanics, those basic things that you learned about any exercise technique, and you take it for granted. It's like, yeah, I already know this, big deal. And then you go back and say, look at what somebody who's a real serious expert does. And you find out almost immediately that they're doing that so much better than us that it just humbles us on the spot. I got a dang doctorate degree, and I ain't bragging, but I go to some of these conferences and I watch these people with bachelor's degree, and you know there's supposed to be this big divide between them. There isn't. I go through and watch some of those people do what they do and explain things the way they explain them, and I'm like, how stupid am I for not seeing that right in front of my face all these years? And they've gone back to those basic texts, and they're doing it so much better than people like myself. And it comes down to something as simple as that. All right, power, force times distance over time, that kind of stuff. You put those basic elements together. Power development does depend on force and distance over time. Strength, about the closest one to force we have there in its multiple hundred definitions, is only one aspect and can't do it alone. If I had nothing else and I was going to do no other form of training, maybe I didn't have the time to work with my athletes, I would go for the strength training. I would forsake all other things if I couldn't do anything else and institute strength training, if that's all I had. Beyond what I do on the court or on the field or in the pool, you name it, I would work with the strength stuff. You can't really lose because it is part of the whole continuum. You get the best of many different worlds. And so strength training itself isn't going to maximize the characteristic, but it will give you a good start. And I like to think of power as much as a performance characteristic and a variable, and it does have to be trained for specifically to maximize that. And honestly, I talked about those basics that you need to go back and look at to really understand that. When we train for power, every single part of the neuromuscular system gets better at what they do. You release that acetylcholine, remember that stuff? You release the acetylcholine from the electrical impulse, it crosses the neuromuscular gap or the synaptic cleft, goes into the muscle, and is basically reconverted to an electrical signal once again, and then it spreads all throughout the muscle, activating the actin and myosin. You release the calcium, and the actin and myosin go like this, sliding filament theory. All right? But every single part of that breakdown improves in performance when we train specifically to release a more powerful electrical signal, to not only shoot that acetylcholine across that gap, and this happens faster and more effectively. We learn to actually break down ATP faster than we used to do it. We stimulate the chemicals to break down ATP faster when we practice for that. It's all part of the stimulus. It's amazing how the most basic things we learned back when do this stuff. Ruins the finesse and swing mechanics as a strength coach. Wow, I've had too much of this. I wouldn't put this in here, honestly, if we weren't getting so much of it. It's still part of what the sport coaches are often believing. We buy into it oftentimes, and I almost got wore down by it. Simply because I heard it so much, I got so much blowback. I know we have to compromise with our coaches as strength and conditioning people. All right, we do have to make them happy, but we also need to look out for the best interests of that players. And the truth of the matter is that it's simply not true. Caveat, got to be careful with that. If I'm training a tennis player like I do a linebacker, there is an issue, guaranteed. All right, we have to be very careful with that kind of stuff. So we really have to go back and analyze these things. We need to learn things specific. Overhead athletes. What about a golfer that is different than a linebacker? What do I need to institute? How can I help them maintain that? I can't do anything if any of these athletes, baseball players, have